So this is a learning session. So some of you may know bits of this already. Some of you may know all of it already, of course, in which case hopefully it'll work as a good refresher. Some of you may not know much about life cycle modelling, but the idea is that this is a learning session and that people can familiarise themselves again with what life cycle modelling is and why we use it. It's about understanding both the process of life cycle modelling and the actual software model. There's not one size necessarily, but what we mean by life cycle modelling versus the model. To gain a detailed understanding of the modelling process, so that whole process that goes into life cycle modelling. To know what to expect if you carry out life cycle modelling, what outputs will you get, and then being able to use outcomes for evidence-based decisions. And you notice I've said outputs and then outcomes. So outputs is one thing. That's a level of information, but outcomes is where you really start turning them into information that works for decision making. Okay, so what we're going to do, take an hour or so. Depends on questions during the time or questions at the end as well. But we're going to go through and broken down into parts. So I can take questions either during each part or at the end of each part, as well as at the end of the session. What is it and why do we use it? What goes into life cycle modelling? The deterioration model. So this is quite an important part of any life cycle modelling. And that tells you really what it is. So this is all about, the kind of how the model and how the process works. And then we talk about what you really need to do in order to prepare the model, what kind of data we need, what goes on in terms of the forecasting, and then looking at the outcomes and how you would look at things in the future when you've done your one life cycle modelling, what happens then. So that's the basic structure. Okay, any questions before I go into the first part? So part one, what is it and why do we use it? Okay, so I put two things on there, scheme identification, and I guess a lot of you will be very used again to working with scheme identification, tends to be the more immediate needs of the highway asset. So we're looking at often 1 to 3 years, maybe 1 to 5, if you want a medium-term plan for scheme identification. And it's usually based on current conditions, so it'll be based on all the information that you have now about what needs fixing. And it identifies individual locations. You may not be able to fix all those locations. You may not be able to carry out maintenance on your entire long list, but you're locating logical areas for schemes in the near future. With life cycle modelling, obviously we're doing something quite different. So we're looking a long time ahead. We're looking at least 20 years, sometimes up to 60 years, depending on the extent of modelling that the council wants to do. And what we're doing is we're forecasting. So we're looking ahead and saying, what do we think the future condition will be? So although the current condition is important in that, so are all the gubbins, if you like, that go into the ability to forecast. And lifecycle modelling doesn't usually identify individual locations in the same way that scheme identification does. It's often a strategic tool, so you're looking at maybe how all your A roads might work, but not necessarily an individual A road. You can do lifecycle modelling for individual roads. I would caution that you just need to watch for false certainty, really, because it can be very, very difficult to predict exactly what will happen to a single road over 60 odd years. Possible, probably more likely with some constructed roads or some very important roads such as A roads. Okay, so why life cycle modelling? Well, it's all about managing the asset, of course, and something that all of you on the call will do every day. And it normally refers to, as I've put here, this is a PricewaterhouseCoopers definition, the development and operation of a business's physical assets throughout their life cycle. So that can mean from cradle to grave. It can include disposal. A bit different when we're talking about highways rather than buildings, for example. Clearly, there are various stages in a building, in a property, or fleet, or equipment, other types of equipment that can often be more time-based. With highways, we're talking very much more about a risk-based approach and how is the asset going to perform? How long is it going to be safe? And of course, roads have lasted a very, very long time, um, albeit not always in good condition. So that's what we're looking at, asset lifecycle management. And then the life cycle strategy sets out this overall method for how you want to manage it. So what is it that we need to do? Yeah, we need to look after the asset, but how do we do that? And a strategy that sort of lays out what you're going to do. And in order to have a strategy, you need to understand what it is that you're dealing with. So just going into some definitions, again, it might be familiar to a lot of you on the call, but I always find it's quite useful when starting to ground ourselves again. And what are we talking about here? What are we really looking at? So when we're talking about life cycle modelling, that's actually an active verb, if you like. It's actually an active way of doing something. So we're talking about the entire process for analysing, understanding, and taking on a life cycle strategy. So actually looking at that overall overarching strategy, you have to do things in order for that to happen and for that strategy to become something. The life cycle model generally refers to a tool that will enable analysis and comparison. And that could be all sorts of things. You know, sometimes it's as simple as a spreadsheet. Sometimes it's as complex as some really, in detail coding. Um, but what the tool is doing is, if you like, performing in a way that helps us understand and decide on how we want to put our strategy together. So it shows us the balance between the costs of doing things, the costs of not doing things, the risks, the opportunities, if there are any, and what performance outcomes will happen through that. So what is the asset going to be like, according to which strategies you choose. So it's a tool effectively, and it could be a tool that varies greatly in its design and complexity. Now, we're a company that obviously works with data, and data led is very much something that we all talk about now. And for things to be data led, obviously it needs humans to shape that data and humans to extract that data, and also then to make the best use of software so that actually the analytics that are being run on that data brings useful information out of it. So this is one of the things that we specialize in within Gaist, which is really combining the human element and the human expertise along with data analytics and computer science. So when we're talking about data analytics, we're talking about, again, various tools. So the tools that we can use and will want to use are predictive analytics. So that's about using historical data. So what data do you have in the past? What does that show you about certain things? Any past trends, so performance trends, for example, red, amber, green trends, anything that you've got that would be useful to show how your network performs, and any assumptions that we can answer questions with. So if you think about weather forecasting, for example, doesn't always get it absolutely right, 3 months into the future. But what they can tell us, for example, is if El Nino is in this position and this is also going on, then in the past this has happened, and therefore we can use that to help us predict into the future. And we're doing something quite similar with the highway assets. So we're looking at, well, this happened and this preventative maintenance lasts for this long. So we can make some assumptions about what will happen in the future. Data modeling is the use of the software tools. So that takes raw data and turns it into structured and often visual information. And now this is something I often forget, but at the bottom of it all, it's still binary. So there is quantum computing, which will be another leap. But actually, everything that we see, all this artificial intelligence, all this modeling, all the code, is still fundamentally working on binary computation. So basically, using those software tools is turning your engineering information and your engineering inputs through something that turns it into something completely unknown, and then out the other side into something that actually makes sense again to us. And one of the things, again, that can be used with data analytics is machine learning. So we hear a lot about AI, and we hear a lot in highways, particularly about computer vision, so the very visual AI that looks at imagery. But actually, there's an awful lot of other AI that goes on, which is about using machines to help with learning. So with machine learning, we teach the machine effectively how to use data and algorithms in the way that we would learn. So, to start not quite understanding, because AI can't really understand in the same way that we do, but to imitate the way that you would gradually improve your accuracy and learn from the more and more data that you get in. And again, that's an awful lot about number crunching rather than the more attractive looking imagery, but it's a very important issue. And one of the things within highways is we talk again about big data. Now, machine learning can help crunch a lot of big data, but actually with highways, we're often talking about quite localized data, quite individualistic data. And so we're also with lots of gaps in. So we don't always know when a road was necessarily, or how a road was first built. And I will talk about that a lot more. But actually, a lot of the machine learning we do is not necessarily about heaving huge data sets. It's about making sense of all the data that we have and making sure that we can extrapolate the most from it. So I probably don't need to ask this question in a sense. Why have a life cycle strategy? You're out there managing highways, and you know what you need to do. You know what you need to do maybe tomorrow, the next day, and into the future. But actually, obviously, there are things, doesn't always, it's not always easy to foresee exactly what's going to happen. And actually, even with life cycle modeling, you can't. So there is a strategy that says we'd like to do things, and what you need to look at periodically is that strategy on the right track. So it's a good planning and budgeting tool for making decisions, and that's actually quite a primary use of it, to say, well, look, I can do this and this, and I need this much money, or actually I need to spend my money like this. But it also enables you to make some of those decisions about trade-offs and balances. So, can you ask for more money? Will you be getting more money? What about inflation? What happens if I do this? And that's a really important part of it, because that's getting a bit more into the detail of the strategy and the detail of the actual work that you need to do. Um, you can assess how current decisions impact in the longer term, and again, that's quite important. If you're doing things in a certain way, what happens in the longer term? If you're only doing resurfacing, for example, how does that pan out over the longer term? Um, the impact of changing requirements, again, that's another really big thing. We know that in the UK, generally, we're getting a more elderly population. That's not true, though, for every local authority. So again, you have to look at your own local authority. But in terms of your demographics, what does that mean? What does it mean, for example, older people with less mobility, particularly if it comes to driving or footways? What do they need from the asset? Is there a different sort of need for the asset, in terms of its performance for those sort of people? And clearly, carbon as well is a massive issue. And again, I will talk about that later. But we need to understand how we can, best manage carbon outputs. And then evidence as well. So often people will see the short-term benefits of schemes, for example, but this provides evidence of cost and benefits over the longer term. And we often refer to highways as, the most important and valuable social asset we can have. And this is evidencing actually what the benefits of looking after that can be. Okay, so if there's any questions during the presentation, just put your hand up, and Kitty will let me know. This is taken from Well Managed Highways, which is Code of Practice 2016, adopted in 2018 by all local authorities, well managed highway infrastructure. So again, the emphasis on managing it and asset management. It has 4 core objectives, which I know that you all work with daily again. So customer service, obviously, network safety, these are very important and very much immediate demands, if you like, of the role. And then sustainability and serviceability. So a life cycle modelling and life cycle strategy very much fits in to these core objectives. So about how do you achieve integrity and reliability? How do you minimise cost over time? How do you ensure resilience? How do you maximise the environmental contribution? How do you maximize its value? These are all quite long-term questions as well as more immediate ones. And then, of course, it enables you to talk more in a more informed way, both to the customers and obviously about users' needs, and how your network will perform in terms of safety over the longer term. So it ties in very much to the everyday job, albeit it's a strategy. And I know that there are strategies that can be pages and pages long, and you think, I'm never even going to read it all, never mind, actually use it. But the point about a life cycle strategy is it is really talking about the things that make a difference to every day. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a minute, just make sure were there any questions or if anybody wants to go back over anything. Okay, I shall move on then. So, part two, what goes into life cycle modelling? Okay, so I talked about the process being a very active form of getting information. So it's definitely not just about putting something in one end of a machine and getting something out the other end. Can be that, but you'll probably find, and we will talk about this as I go through, you'll probably find that that's actually quite limiting. Certainly at the very beginning, you need to define your objective. So what is it that you want to know? What kind of things do you want to go in there? And I will talk about each of these sections in more detail as we go along. So I won't go into it too much, but you can see there are various priorities that you might want to look at in order to tell you what you want to think about. We've got a big one about data and how we need data to go into the life cycle modelling process. Again, I've got quite a lot on that later. This, if you like, is the machine part where the data modelling goes on. Although even then, there are ways of testing it and making sure that what's coming out is not just garbage, and that involves human knowledge as well. Then we've got the outputs, and they need to be, so there are outputs at that point. You want outcomes, you want things that you can interpret, communicate to other people, non-engineers, non-highway people, and eventually decisions that you incorporate into your strategy. And then at the end of it, how you apply it, how you review it, and when you might want to update. So that's effectively the whole process. And you can see, it comes round at regular intervals. It's not necessarily something that you have to do annually. But again, we'll talk about how it can benefit looking at your longer term as well as your shorter term on a regular basis. So clearly, I mean, we're in very much of a sort of exponential rise in the use of computers and how much they can do and how clever they can be. If you want to write, poetry to loved ones, there's Chat GPT, etc. And there can be a faith that they'll get things right, but of course, all computers are built by humans, and so that's one thing, that they're as reliable as the way that they have been built and the information that's been put into them. But there's another part about models as well, in that once they're built, how do they respond to the data that's going into them? So you can have your data. So you could start, for example, with just your condition data, and you could put it into a mathematical model that's got this fixed recipe, and it will come out with some very precise stuff at the end of it. So you can say, well, actually, I've got an exact knowledge of what's going to happen. And the trouble with that is it can give first of all, some false certainty. So we have to ask ourselves, can we really be precise about highways 60 years into the future? Are we sure we can be? And the other issue is that you can't really change that. That's rather fixed, and it's fixed whoever puts that data in, whether you're an urban local authority, whether you're a rural one, small, large, whether you've got an aging population or not. It's a very fixed way of doing things. Nothing wrong with that. But for data-led models, you have to let the data help the model in ways that respond to any new information and respond to specific circumstances. Now, that's not to say that the model gets changed every time, a different authority uses it, not at all. But what it does mean is that continually, didn't say that very well, continually, looking at historical data and how that can update and improve the mathematical model, as well as the baseline data, such as condition data. Now, that can mean, rather like weather forecasting, that you don't get a precise answer, because there can be uncertainties, and what you're doing is you're admitting about those uncertainties. So we know certain things we can't be absolutely sure about 45 years in the future. But what you will get is a very good probability. And that's what we're looking at. So we're looking at what is the probability, and how do we manage that probability to reduce as much uncertainty as possible. That gives you the opportunity to make decisions. And this is where your own knowledge comes in. This should tie in with the things that you know, the things that you are aware of within your highways, and the things that you learn every day in the job. That leads obviously to program delivery, monitoring and evaluation, and then again, of course, more data. And eventually that baseline data becomes historical data, and we can see how things perform again over time. So this is the Gaist lifecycle model. It's not, as I say, a total sausage machine. You don't just put something in here and then immediately get something out of here. It's actually a lot of code in the background, but also humans to work with you through it. So consultant who will take you through the stages of the lifecycle model, take things away, and discuss at the end of it all the outputs. So these are all the input side, if you like, the things that go into the life cycle model. Sitting here is the deterioration model, and then all of these feed into the life cycle model for you, for your local authority, which leads to the outputs that are your outputs, and those include all the things listed here. I'm going to talk about, as I said, each part of that as we go along, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this particular slide, but it just gives you an idea of what goes into it, and then how it gets shaped in this bit here, which you might be relieved to know you don't really have to do a lot with. That's something else that you leave to the consultant and the software. Any questions on that part? Okay. So I'm going to talk about the deterioration model, and really this is the engine room, if you like, of how we do life cycle modelling. So it's an absolutely critical element. How do roads deteriorate? As it would be in any sort of asset management. So you really should know, when you need to replace certain things. Now, again, that might be easier in a very straightforward building than it is with a highway, and whether that's footway, carriageway, other parts. How they deteriorate can be quite complex. Now, there are certain things which are still time-based. So I believe there's certain components in street lighting, for example, where you might want to actually do a time-based change, because actually the lux will fall, the light levels will fall over a certain amount of time, and at a certain point in their life, that's they're not going to do what you want. But there are other types, and I might be wrong about that, so I'm quite happy for anyone who works absolutely in street lighting still to let me know, especially with LEDs now. But in terms of highways, we talk about often them having an indefinite life. So actually there's a lot of layers to highways, and those layers can perform quite differently. How it's built can make a difference. What's on the surface can make a difference. Lots of things that happen on the surface can make a difference. So although it's a critical element, it can be quite difficult to get to the bottom of. And that's a particular case with local roads. So we know a lot more probably about some of our motorway and A roads that were constructed around about from the 50s onwards. We had a big road building programme. Even then, though, there can be uncertainties about all sorts of things. But typically, when we look at any sort of deterioration, particularly, an asset, we think of a deterioration curve, that it will start as good. There can be a quite sharp deterioration as soon as something is built, but generally after that it will go in a curve. With roads, often you might see something sharper, so that it does drop off quite substantially between this part and this part. Or you might even see, if there's maintenance, that curve would rise again because you've done some preventative maintenance, and then eventually it would drop. And then obviously if you renewed the whole thing, it would go right back up to very good. But then again, with local roads, it becomes much more uncertain. Are we talking about the surface? Are we talking about the structural layers? When we're talking about rehabilitation, are we talking about resurfacing? Are we talking about completely restructuring the local road? How often does that happen? When did it last happen? These are all sorts of questions that become quite difficult. And so that lovely, lovely deterioration curve isn't necessarily what happens. It's much more uncertain. And that's a subject I return to again and again. What we're doing with life cycle modelling is we're reducing as much as possible that uncertainty and giving you some information on which you can make some data-led decisions. But it doesn't mean that we can say in 60 years' time your highway will be absolutely and accurately like this. But what we are doing is we're basing our modelling as much as possible on real-world information. And that is important. So, how local roads have already performed can make a big difference to how they're going to perform in the future. Now, just to illustrate, obviously, what I guess we know about local roads, how do they deteriorate if the reality doesn't match modern specifications? So here you have, an ideal way of putting in bituminous structure for a road. From the the specification for reinstatement of highway works. And here you have what is actually a local bus route just down the road from me, and that's a lot of chalk and flint, thin layer of bituminous material. Not quite sure what else might be under that chalk and flint. Possibly not much, courtesy of the local gas network. I noticed once there were some house bricks used as a capping layer, but then just a lot of chalk on top of that. So it can be very interesting what your local roads are composed of, and that can obviously make a difference to how the surface performs as well as how the structure performs. So, how do we design our deterioration models given all those issues? Well, what we did is we used AI machine learning to a sample data set, but a large sample data set, and we used it across time as well as across areas. So that's quite important. It's not just about, you can watch a certain spot for 30 years maybe, and that will give you some very valuable information about that. But actually, that's quite a narrow sample. So what we're trying to do is take not just a huge time series, but also a huge area series, if you like. So from multiple authorities, and that gives us good parameters to use. And it's looking at local roads again predominantly. So we're looking at how these local roads perform. And what we've also got is imagery going back many, many years as well. So we can actually look back and see, for example, the impact of smaller scale repairs such as planned patching. I don't necessarily mean the pre-patching that you do for surface dressing, but I mean the larger patches. How do they hold up? What benefit do they bring to the road instead of full resurfacing, for example? These are all the important things that we can ask ourselves and we can look at, and we can use all that historical data, including data from local authorities. So if you do have historical data, it can be extremely useful to incorporate in. So when you did something, what the impact was when you next did something. So what we've ended up with, actually that figure is no longer 700, that's more than that now. It's over 1,000 kilometres of schemes over 21 years. And we've also looked at footways. So we do have a deterioration model for footways. We've looked at lots and lots of street records, predominantly concrete and flagged, and also now more and more bituminous are coming into the issue as well. And a lot of bituminous footways now are beginning to reach a time where we really do need to look at them and what's going on with them. So when we talk about machine learning, well, what are we doing with that? Well, yeah, so we've got all these samples, which again is data. And what do we do with that data? We have to make it meaningful. We have to make it shape a deterioration model. So what we're looking at is we're looking at combining our asset management knowledge, which we do have within Gaist, and we're very lucky to have particularly a senior consultant with some excellent asset management knowledge and absolutely amazing coding and data analytics ability. So we're combining probability theory effectively. So we're using very established scientific probability theories along with that asset management knowledge and data to look at what are the likely outcomes, knowing what we know. If you think about that predictive analysis we talked earlier, knowing what we know, what is the likely outcomes in the future. And so what we're modelling really is how do roads deteriorate? And there are lots of different ways of displaying this. We've chosen to do it like this because what we're trying to do is let's take it as new, but then what happens? Does everything deteriorate at the same rate? Does it deteriorate in the same way? And we're looking at, how does that deterioration occur? It's unlikely that something goes from a grade 1 to a grade 5 immediately. It normally goes through these, but as you can see, there are different ways that something might progress. potentially it could go to a grade 5 if there's some, some really horrible stuff happens. But again, is that surface or is that structural? These are lots of different questions that we try to figure out. And obviously the current condition can tell you particularly about what's going on now, but we want to know clearly what happens, how does it progress through to that? And so this model, all that clever stuff that goes into it, is based as close as possible to the real world and to the types of local highway. So we're not just assuming that, an A road performs the same as a cul-de-sac just because it's bituminous. We're not assuming that a concrete road deteriorates in the same way as a bituminous, for example. So, there are ways where all that local data has made a really big difference to how the model applies those patterns of deterioration. And because it's a model and because we want to learn all the time, how do we ensure even better accuracy? And so that's not just about the model itself. So, that's we periodically review our model. Again, I'll talk about that later, and we periodically add more data samples into it, and that's one way obviously of improving it. But even when we're doing it for an individual local authority, we will validate against previous data if we've got that. So for example, if you've got the last 5 years of condition data, we could run our model as if we're predicting those 5 years and compare our results to the results that actually happened. And then we can calibrate the model a bit better towards actually how your roads are performing. We can do visual checks, which I've mentioned again, because we've got that imagery against maintenance history. And obviously we can use local maintenance data, any data that you have. And all that can be updated into the new model as well, into the model, sorry. Anything on that before I move on? Okay, so that in a sense is the background before you get involved really in your own life cycle modeling. That's the kind of thing that's going on in the background. Why are we doing it? What do we need to do from it? And, making sure that deterioration model is working as well as it can be, ready for your data. So this is where I guess you come into it. If you want to do life cycle strategies, the starting point is defining the objectives. So what is it that you want to know? You're going to do this big piece of work on, looking forward over 60 years. So what are the important questions to ask? Now, some of those will link in with the council priorities, and some of those will be some very fundamental questions, particularly around finances often. And particularly at the moment, I worked very much in, the first round of austerity, if you like, and that was grim. And since then, we've obviously had all sorts of conflicts, a pandemic, and it's still grim. So often a big question is what happens if the budget doesn't change? What happens if we get no more money, whether that's revenue or capital? And we can make the difference. We can split that up in life cycle modelling, but effectively what happens is this is all the money that I have. That's obviously a common thing to explore. It can also be what happens if the budget does change? What happens if I get X more? What happens if I get less? All of those are important questions. Another one often is, could be asked, could be a very useful bit of information to take to members. If we wanted to improve our network, what do we need to do? If we don't want anything to ever go into really poor condition, what is it that we need to do? How much money do we need to have? But also, what actual maintenance activities do we need to do? And what happens if we just want to keep things as they are? So we're not trying to aim for the stars, but equally don't want it to deteriorate any more than it is. So often called a steady state. What actually is it? What do we need to do to keep up with that, to keep it at least as is now? So those are often the primary questions. It is a strategy, and it is important to set highways into context with public services. Now, clearly, people's needs are very immediate, and social care, children's services have very, very immediate needs, and that can't be denied. But highways, as we know, does touch everybody's lives as well, and it is a public service. So it's important to set that in context. So looking at council priorities, any local transport plans or active travel plans, there's some national plans such as Bus Back Better. There's net zero, obviously, to pay attention, but there could also be local planning and social or economic strategies. So it doesn't always have to be a pure engineering strategic approach. Life cycle modelling and scheme identification can also look at what is it that you want to achieve for your citizens, what is it that you want to achieve for your area, and then how best can that be done. But it is ultimately a business approach as well. The last thing we want is that it's just a document that nobody ever looks at. So we want to ensure that it's a planning tool. So it should be linked to your business objectives, how we want to plan things, what the performance targets are, are there opportunities for new choices? And what is the council's financial strategy and how does it tie into that? How is what you're doing going to fit with the budget that Highways has and the strategy that the council has? So what we're doing really with the life cycle strategy is we're creating a blueprint that you can work to. And it's a blueprint that should inform your maintenance plans, maybe your medium maintenance plan rather than your schemes themselves. But we do actually feed how you do schemes into the life cycle strategy. And I will come back to that in the next section. So it's focused on those objectives. It should be adaptable. It's very difficult, again, to set something in stone for 60 years. It's not, I don't know how many people would still be working in highways who are on this call right now in 60 years, but even 10, 15 years ahead, you have to adapt to unforeseen circumstances. We had the pandemic, for example, and that changed the way a lot of things had to be. And it should feed into this maintenance plan, which allows you to be more focused on the outputs and more nailing down actions in the medium term. Okay, anything on that at all before I move on? Nope. Okay, so data-led. Data is very important, obviously. A lot of the actual data part that goes in is information, in a sense, about the condition of the road. I'm going to talk about life cycle stages, and that's very much bound up with how you might renew the life cycle of a road. Any works history, reactive repair rates, etc., rates for costs of preventative and capital treatments, and all of this needs to go in terms of data. There's more data down here as well, obviously, but let's talk about highway data in the first place. So clearly asset data provides important information. It's invaluable, obviously. And again, depending on what you're doing, your inventory might be very, very good. It might have some gaps in it, it might not, or it might be held in lots of different formats. So what we need to know is how much do you have? What format is it in? How usable is it? And is it accurate and reliable? Now, you can't necessarily guarantee that for everything, and that's okay. Actually, that's one of the reasons we build the deterioration model as closely as possible to everything we know. But it obviously does depend on what we have. So if we're looking at, say, road markings, then your historic data would be useful. Your condition data over a certain amount of time would again be useful, because we need that information to recalibrate the deterioration model to look at line markings, not at footways, for example, or with street lighting again. Anything like that, then we need to be sure that we've got enough data, again, to make sure that the model is reflecting how that asset deteriorates. So there's lots of different things that can be helpful, that goes into making the model as good as possible. If we're talking about carriageway or footway, I just put up the Roman roads. I'm sure there are people on the call who will know that they've got an original Roman road going through there. Maybe not Cornwall, I don't know. Really no Roman roads in Cornwall. But you can see roads have been around for a very, very long time. And obviously that means they have been built up over the years in lots of different ways. The principal thing that we need to know to start life cycle modelling, particularly with roads, so with carriageways and footways, because we've got a lot of information, is what condition is it in? And we can take it from there. There are other questions that are also very useful. What are the rates for maintenance? Again, we can use standard maintenance rates, but if you've got your own rates, why wouldn't we incorporate those? That would make it much more accurate for your local authority. Obviously, the different classes of the asset, how you want to break them down. And these, if you've got anything else as well, this can all help make the model more relevant to your own local authority. Okay, so that's talking about the data that you can supply. And again, as I say, first and foremost, particularly carriageways and footways, what condition is it in? And we can take it from there. But anything else that you have makes the model just that little bit more receptive to what goes on for you. But then, of course, this is the bit where all the other impacts on highway asset management come in. So inflation comes in, budget versus inflation. Again, I'll talk about that. How you might prioritise, how you mend things, how you allocate your treatments, for example, and what performance targets you might be expected to perform too. So these are all things that we also need to put in. They're perhaps, again, less certain than some of the asset data, inflation, for example. So I'm going to talk about what we do with those aspects of the inputs. And don't forget, these are still all inputs at the moment. These are telling the model what they need to bring together in order to forecast into the future. Now, one of the things that we do look at is what we call localized condition versus life cycle stages. You could call that something different, but I'm going to explain what we mean by that. So localized condition is, if you like, the red, amber, green, or in Gaist's case, we use a 5 grading system. That gives us that little bit more granularity when we're looking at the highway. So blue is damage free, as new, red is very poor, amber is poor, yellow, serviceable. So average, if you like, it's okay. And then you get some green as well, which means that it's really just beginning to show some very early signs of deterioration. Okay, so that's fine. And you could say, well, obviously, one of the functions of looking after the highway is to make sure that those very poor areas at some stage get addressed and mended. And that's true. One of the issues, though, with particularly the original HMET life cycle model, which was actually very useful and the first sort of highways model that anybody could use. But having said that, one of the things was it took the very poor, if you like, and said, well, highways move through this approach. So very poor, you will mend at some stage and become very good, and then amber will become very poor, and then average will become poor, etc. And that is true, of course, up to a point. But what is actually the case, and this is why we talk about life cycle stages, is that's not always how you do schemes. So actually how you mend a road over a period of years can be very different from taking each of these red patches and putting them into new. So here you can see in this scheme, for example, this idealized scheme or whatever, if you like, what's happening here is, in order to make a logical, cost-effective scheme, we're taking even some of the bits of the highway that are in average condition that actually at the moment you might not mend. And depending on what your surface, what your treatment is, you could find that you turn all of that part of the highway absolutely to very good again. So it all becomes blue, even though actually you might not have mended those individual bits left in their own sort of individual localized condition. So if you're following me, and I hope you are, the important part of our model is that it represents what you do for treatments. And that makes it much more lifelike to how your highway will perform over the coming years. Because obviously, if we just said, well, that yellow bit eventually will fall into very poor, we're not taking into account that you mended it because you needed to as that part of the scheme, or you felt it was logical to do so. So one of the things that we will do is we will take into account how you do treat highways at a strategic level. Obviously, we're looking again at your network. So how you have treatment rules for, say, your A roads, when you might resurface rather than when you might do preventative works, how much you might enable prep patching, how much you might push your preventative works towards early or late, for example. So all of these things make a difference about how your highway is actually going to be over the coming years. Actually, just there, any questions on that one before I go on? Okay. Hopefully it all made sense to people. And it is actually a very important part of trying to make the deterioration model as close as it can be. Another one that brings in lots of uncertainty, budgets versus inflation. So again, a model that assumes you will get an inflationary increase in line with inflation every year isn't always as helpful as one that enables you to model inflation differently from what your budget might be. Now, the reason I say that is because, for a start, councils haven't necessarily had an inflationary increase on their capital budgets every year. For another thing, the revenue budget can follow the consumer price index, but that doesn't always happen, especially when the consumer price index is very high. And that doesn't necessarily filter down to highways anyway. It does depend still on what proportion of the revenue budget you get from the council centre. And obviously, the other point is that the construction index can be very different. So aggregates, for example, virgin aggregates, the price of those very, very different from perhaps some other commodities. Obviously, oil is very susceptible to conflicts, wars, etc., and what goes on across the world. So in actual fact, that annual setting of a budget for the council can be very, very different from what you're paying out in terms of inflation. So again, what do? Well, we try and work as closely as possible to the indexes that matter to you. So there is the British Construction Index, which plots how things have developed over time. And as you can see here, there's a massive increase at that point in January 2021. So it looks at previous trends, but also it can look at predictive trends as well. So again, this one is only up to 2022, but as you can see, we're looking at sort of the consumer price index versus the road construction industry index. So it does have a breakdown for highways, not just for properties and building. And you can see the difference between the CPI, for example, and construction, difference in the inflationary increase. So we use this data to shape the model. And the other thing now that the British Construction Index does is also do its own forecasting into a certain amount of time. So that enables us as well to take at least the medium term and use people who are used to financial forecasting and used to the construction industry, giving us the detail that we need to incorporate into our model. So again, part of this modelling involves finding the best data and then testing assumptions to find the most likely scenarios. So again, with inflation, we can't say for certain what's going to happen in the future, particularly not even, I mean, we didn't necessarily all foresee what was going to happen over the last 5 years. So even if we've got fairly stable predictions for the next 2 years, there can be something that throws that completely out. But what we can do again is use that probability and all the forecasting material that we've got at our fingertips to test out what we think will happen in the future and to make that, again, as accurate as we can, but bearing in mind that there are uncertainties. And while we're talking about uncertainties, the impacts of climate change. Now, I know that there's recently been a DFT consultation document on preparing, how to be resilient in the face of climate change. There's no doubt that it's happening. There's no doubt that it's making an impact already. And we know there'll be more extremes. We don't always know what those extremes will be. Recently, we've had a lot of flooding, and that is likely to be the case in the UK, but also it's got a lot warmer. And that's across, obviously, the globe. So what impact is that going to have as we go forward? Again, we can look as much as possible at all the forecasts, and we can look as much as possible about all the information there. But we do have to acknowledge that there will be some sort of uncertainty about how much climate change over time will affect the highway asset. And again, the more information, the more we go through, the more we can incorporate our knowledge and our findings from climate change into our deterioration model. So if we know we're always going to get very wet springs, we can start putting that more and more into the deterioration model as an actual factor. Carbon emissions, again, that's a really important thing to know when you're looking at your strategy over time. Again, that's going to be uncertain because we don't know what else will come online. We don't know when your local authority would be happy maybe to use different types of materials and different types of treatments. And we also need to know how long new materials will last. And that's still sometimes tested, sometimes not. Some treatments now have been around for a very long time, some low carbon treatments, more are coming on the market all the time. So there's different periods of time we've already had to collect data on those. And as time goes on, there'll be more and more information. Now, when we're looking at carbon emissions, it's a sad fact that highways is a carbon emitter generally, not just the traffic on it, obviously, but also almost all the works that we do on highways has a degree of carbon emissions. Now, those can be reduced over time, certainly electric vehicles, hydrogen, and the treatments that you use. At the moment, though, we still have to confess that, if you're going to, for example, resurface all your roads, there would actually be a high carbon emission from that. When we're looking at life cycle modelling strategy, that could actually be quite depressing, because if you're saying, well, actually, we're going to invest in our highway and we're going to give the public a better highway, your carbon emissions are naturally going to go up. Now, to calculate those, we use the RSTA, the Road Surface Treatment Association's document, which is really a really good document that they developed with a consultant looking at carbon emissions from cradle to lade for all the different types of treatment. And obviously, we keep an eye on the other carbon tools around as well. So we incorporate those to calculate emissions. But the other thing that we do when we're projecting carbon outputs, or carbon emissions, if you like, over time, is we do use fuel consumption information. Now, that offsets, in fact, the fact that you're spending carbon to renew the road, but you're also then saving carbon on fuel consumption. So it's not necessarily a direct saving to the council, but it is a direct saving to the local environment. Now, these are both data-led bits of information. The fuel consumption information, again, is taken from national statistics and data. But obviously there are other benefits as well, which at the moment aren't as data-led, if you like. But obviously the increase in active travel, the increase in healthy living, all of these can offset some of the damage, if you like, that carbon emissions do. But these are the two where we can absolutely categorically say, well, we have used data to inform what comes out. And that leads us neatly onto outcomes. But again, before I move on, is there anything you'd like to ask about that part of the forecasting, and particularly any of the uncertainties around forecasting? Nope. Okay. Okay. So we've talked about putting all of this in. We've talked about this sitting here doing its job and being updated periodically. And we've talked about the life cycle model that is very specific, as you can see, to your local authority. So all of this that goes on, this part here is modelling for your local authority. And out of that comes the information that you need to have for decision making. So it's going to include condition forecasts, carbon forecasts, and also some useful information that backs up your decision making, such as reactive repairs. What happens if you do certain things? What happens to, for example, not just your capital budget, not just your preventative budget, but your reactive budget? Okay, I'm going to revisit the headline scenarios here, because obviously we've asked ourselves questions, and what we want to know is, well, what's the answer, or at least what's some of the answer to those questions. So revisiting some of the ones that I put up: the budget, the improvements, or the steady state. Those are the questions. We often get asked by customers, can you just tell me the best solution? Can you tell me just how much money I need? Well, we could. But of course, it does depend on your priorities, and also it might depend on your treatments. So we could give you, obviously, the budget if all you wanted to do was resurfacing and reactive repairs. But obviously, you'd need to ask yourself, is that the best solution? Well, it might be in terms of sort of absolutely resurfacing your entire highways. But A, that's very unlikely to happen. And B, you couldn't do it all at once, even if you wanted to. So we have to be careful about sort of saying there's always an optimum. As with everything else, there's usually balances to be had. So there's risks, there's opportunities, and there might be different ways of doing things that you can weigh up. So obviously we give you graphs and charts so you can see very visually what might go on. And these are analysed and given you the charts to show things like the condition trend. So what would happen to your red, amber, greens, or your 5 grades if you do this or you do that? What happens if you, well, I'll show you that later, actually, so I won't go into that. What about your performance indicators? What happens if actually your council doesn't want anything to go into grade 5 or into very poor, into red? What does that cost you? For each of these scenarios, what's the capital cost? So here you can see this is the capital cost if we don't put any inflationary predictions on it. Now, it is very important, though, what's the total cost with inflation? So I don't know how well you can see this chart, but we've broken it down into structural here. So what you might do for, resurfacing, for example, and what you might do for preventative. And for example, for this scenario, which is wanting improvements, there's an input in here of budget, for example, the total cost, and then it sort of settles down a bit. But if actually we put inflation into the picture, actually what we're going to be telling members is I need a lot more money than I do at current budget, because actually I need to keep up with the inflationary increases, and we think they're likely to be actually, we're going to have a nice little dip, but then actually this is going to happen. And that's based on as much data as we can. We can also tell you quantities of treatment. So again, that's often profiled for what a local authority could reasonably be expected to achieve within an annual year. And that's partly about how you manage your street works and your road closures, as much as it is about how well or how big a contractor you've got and how much you can actually manage in terms of budget. So that's a really important part. Again, I mentioned what happens with your reactive repairs, for example. So obviously, if you're performing well on your highways and you're reducing the amount of highways in poor condition, you would expect your reactive repairs to reduce accordingly. And it's useful to have that information. And we will ask you for trends on reactive repairs if you have that. So again, we can tailor that as much as possible to your own local authority. Carbon costs we've spoken about, and I'll show you something there. And then down here, the impact of different maintenance approaches. And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. So this is obviously your strategic overview for a particular scenario. So I want to do X over 40 years. What does that give me in terms of types of treatment, budget, and how much treatments? We've talked about performance indicators, so most of you will have seen these types of graphs. So this is very similar to what you get on an annual basis, your red, amber, green, or your 5 grades in our case. So, in this particular year, in 24, for example, you've got this much in good condition, this much in poor condition. If you've got extra budget, well, hey, you're off. And actually, let's say we've got so much extra budget that over the years, gradually over time, we're actually bringing down, the ambition here is not to have anything in poor or very poor. And so actually you're bringing things down, you're increasing the amount of good condition, very good condition, and decreasing the amount of amber, if you like, or serviceable that will fall into poor condition. However, if you have less, again, we can illustrate very clearly, and you can even put graphs together to show without a doubt, whereas you might manage to keep it reasonably stable at the top, what's happening at the bottom is more and more is falling out of the serviceable or the average condition into the poor condition. And obviously some of the reasons it's more stable at the top is you get to a stage where you simply just have to resurface. And so that keeps topping up a little bit more into the very good. But actually what's happening here is you're eating in to your available window of opportunity before the public, the users, and the asset itself is going to become more and more difficult to keep in a reasonable condition. So I mentioned before, you've got headline objectives, but actually what it also should be enabling you to do is make some decisions about how you want to carry out your business. So actually looking at alternative maintenance options. So you will have the way that you do things now, and you'll have the way that you allocate different treatments at different life cycle stages, if you like. So preventative maintenance generally might happen at grade 3. You might want to do some more aggressive treatments, particularly at grade 5, or even some structural work. And so you will have a way of allocating your budgets through those, and also the ways that you do maintenance. Well, what we want to do when we're doing life cycle modelling is not just answer those big questions, what happens if we have less budget, but also look at, well, what happens, what can I do, how can I best use my money to bring out what I need to do. So if I've got some performance measures that I need to meet, but I'm not going to get much more budget, what is the best way of doing that? So what we're doing is we're really testing out how you can get really the best bang for your buck. Now, this sort of graph can make you take a step back at first, because it's a bit like, oh, okay, what am I looking at here? So I just want to talk you through it. So what it is we've got a headline scenario here, and what we're saying is we want to keep the asset in a steady state. So actually we don't want it to get any worse, but we're not aiming for it to get any better. Now, obviously, that will require probably an uplift in budget, but that's not necessarily what I want to look at here. That would be what we tell you in the headlines. We'd say, well, to keep it in a steady state, to make sure you meet this, you need to have this amount of capex, for example, capital money. But what we're doing here is we're looking at how do you actually apply maintenance to achieve that steady state, because a steady state doesn't just happen and avoid. You have to do something to keep it in a steady state. So this is what this particular chart is telling us. So we've taken within that main scenario, we just want to keep it as is. Let's look at your current maintenance rules. What does that achieve for us? Let's look about actually what about if you tackle worst first? So that's going to be your strategy over the next few years. You want to keep it steady, but you want to target all the worst roads. Or what happens, for example, if you're going to not necessarily do the worst first, but you're going to kind of push your preventative to maybe a little bit later in the life. So you're going to do a bit more pre-patching with your preventative. And we could do another scenario as well that said what happens if you intervene earlier, for example, with your preventative. And then what happens is we compare that against various priorities. And ultimately, this enables you to make a decision about what priorities might have more weight against others. You can see here, this is the PI change, so the performance change. It shouldn't actually change because actually you want to keep it in a steady state. It might fluctuate a tiny bit from year to year, but essentially what you're wanting to do is keep it as is. So what you do want to look at, and of course that could be different if you're doing a budget scenario. So actually that PI would change could be quite important, but we're doing steady state here, so we'd expect that to stay the same. What we're actually looking at is, well, what does it cost me? So for example, over the medium term, over the say 5 years, what does that mean in capital expenditure to keep it in a steady state, depending on the different types of maintenance treatment that I use? So if you keep with your current maintenance treatment, it's okay. You know, it's not bad. Your annual capital expenditure will be round about this percentage. If you do the worst first, actually, you are getting more bang for your buck on an annual basis. And if you're doing this steady state in the, over the medium term, you're not necessarily getting quite as good outcomes from what you're spending. However, if you're looking at the whole forecast, and that's an important part too, so we want to know what impact the decisions we're making now have into the future, you start to see quite a different picture. So this is why it can be really important to look over the whole forecast in terms of expenditure, as well as just the annual. So then you start to see that actually your steady state doesn't necessarily give you the best money or the best outcomes for your money. In fact, you can start to see, well, you're still spending a similar amount, but actually you're not getting as much for it as you do here over the steady state, where actually your value for money is much better. And again, over the whole term, your current rules actually bring your money down more. Your overall expenditure down more, but not as much as doing a slightly different way. But then, of course, there's other things. There's the present value of cost. So your bang for your buck over if you took your present costs, how would that project into the future? So it's not necessarily looking sort of inflation or otherwise. I won't go into present value of cost because it's quite complicated. But again, that's something to look at. What does that do for your annual repair rates? So obviously you'd expect steady state to kind of deal with some of those reactive repairs, because they're often the things that you have to, if it's in the worst first, that's where it's really bad, or could get really bad and could develop safety issues at a much quicker rate than something that's in a less poor condition. So you would expect that perhaps to make a difference. But then you've got to ask yourself, well, what am I losing by taking a more financially prudent approach? Well, if you do a steady state, or if you do your current stuff, actually, you're not changing your annual repair rates that much. So then you need to ask yourself, well, does that matter? Is it important that I reduce my repair rates? Actually, is it important that I get better value for my money, and actually that I get better CO2 emissions? Because again, you can see here that preventative work allows you to bring down your carbon emissions much more than if you were doing the worst first. And of course, that's projecting over the longer term. So obviously you can see the impact that has as you go by year on year. And again, change in end of life. Well, if you do all your worst, obviously you'll be moving those up out of end of life and into good. But actually, you can see over the whole period, you don't really keep up. So just doing your worst first doesn't really keep up. So you're thinking, well, actually, I'm making much more of them new, but actually over the whole term, you're losing. You're not keeping up with how many are then falling into the poor category or the average category. And interestingly, actually, you do get better for that if you're doing preventative, or even if you're doing your current way of performing. So I hope that makes sense. If anyone wants to ask any questions about that, please do. But what you're doing is you're comparing the outcomes for each individual aspect or facet, if you like, of highway maintenance. And all of those matter. All of them matter. So if your council doesn't necessarily want to look over the whole term, well, at least you can inform them of the impacts. If actually your pressure is always to do the worst first, you may have to yield to that pressure. You yourselves may think, well, I do need to do some of the worst first. And obviously you do. You can't let everything just absolutely fall apart. What we're talking about, though, is not the scheme that you're going to do next year, but the strategy that you're going to have, and the strategy that hopefully you will take to members and look at them adopting, which will reduce your risks over the longer term. And so that's really what that life cycle modelling is about. And all of this is to give you the information to decide what is important to you, what your members will want to look at, and how you can inform them. Irrespective of the decision that you make, you are informing them. And that really is all that can be asked. So lots of charts, lots of graphs, that's great. But actually you want to make sense of those, and you may want to be presenting those to people for whom that, lots and lots of charts aren't going to be actually as helpful as they would like in terms of decision making. So non-engineering people. We always produce a report. Well, 3 reports actually. One details the methodology. So if anyone says, how is this data led? We can talk to, well, that report will show you exactly how the model works. One on all the charts and graphs, and then the strategic report, if you like, so the findings and the conclusions. So what you want to know is, well, what happens if I do this? And we will summarise that in ways that you can take to non-engineering people. We've done quite a lot of work actually on how we produce the report and actually how we break that down. So originally, I think some of our early adopters had a really long report with everything in it. Now we're looking actually to bring out those really important conclusions, and also to relate those back to strategic issues that are wider than just highways, and in which highways have an important part to play. So if, for example, there's an ageing population, your footway strategy really matters, and it can have more of an impact than perhaps you might just understand from schemes. For example, if your population is going to be aging over the next 20 years, then your strategy needs to take that into account. These are people that are going to be finding it more and more difficult perhaps to navigate around some of the worst footways, or but some of the worst footways will not be the worst footways they are now. So what are you going to do to make sure you don't have the worst footways in 20 years' time? That's the point about the life cycle modelling, really. And of course, maybe there will be huge advances in ageing as well. And actually, with any luck, says she, getting closer, we'll all be leaping about agilely by the time we're sort of 80. But, I'm not sure. It might have helped if I hadn't already hurt bits of me that may not recover. Okay, so the outcomes. What are you looking for? So what you're looking for is evidence-based modelling. So that is important. That is something that's talked about a lot. You don't necessarily need loads and loads of data on your own behalf, but you do need to have faith that the data that is being used closely mirrors the practical elements of maintaining the highway asset. So the things that you do actually do on a daily and on a 4 to 5 year basis. And that for us includes the impact of smaller scale repairs. So reactive repairs up to a point. Reactive repairs are useful to know what happens with them on given what you're doing on a larger scale, but also the impact of proper patching, if you like, or surface dressing or things like that. Things that are maybe on a smaller scale, but actually do matter to the local highway asset. You want a comprehensive way to show the funding required, and so that does need to take into account inflationary pressures as well as budget. and a clear and transparent report that says how those insights are achieved, but also draw out those insights. So those insights must be very clear so that, as I say, non-engineering people can understand them as well as those looking at the graphs and charts in more detail. And a tool, effectively, that tool for strategic decision making and maintenance planning going forward. Okay, anything on that part before I move on? Okay. Right, so we're going to talk about reviewing and updating. So refreshing a life cycle model, it's up to you how often you would want to do that. Obviously, it's a strategy document. Some local authorities do choose to do that annually because new stuff comes to light all the time. And the more we do that for a specific local authority, the more that model becomes attuned to that local authority. But also, models can't learn on their own. And this is a very important thing. Unless you're telling that model to learn, unless you're inputting that data into the algorithms, it won't learn. It won't just learn on its own. And that's the same with computer vision. Computer vision can run over and over something, but unless you're telling it to add it to its training data, then it won't be doing that. It will just be turning out the same thing. So that is an important thing to know about AI. Yes, AI can create its own training data if you tell it to, so it can make up stuff to train itself on. But if you wanted to train on real data, you do have to keep feeding that model. And that's what we will do. So we'll continue to test and update our model in the background. For you, refreshing that model means obviously relying on the models that we build and putting your new data in and looking at the insights that come out from that. And so that's good for ongoing decision making for the direction of highway management. And also, obviously, new things will come in. So there may be new methods and materials. That is a kind of best case. That's good news. That's optimistic stuff. Or there could be some horrible stuff, obviously, that comes in as we've experienced over the last few years with pandemics and conflicts. So, it allows you to incorporate the impacts that has on what you're doing. Now, one of the things that we have done and what our model and our data management and our actual data repository has allowed us to do is been talking a lot now, produce reports for the DFT. One on lining the way was using AI to both analyse, so computer vision and crunching in the background to examine the current state of road markings across England. So that was very much to help the DFT understand where we were at, particularly in terms of not just safety now and safety in terms of more vulnerable users, but also looking again to the future for more autonomous car driving and other vehicles. And then the really important one was the footways as well. So that did use projections into the future. So it was about the current condition of footways, and we used a large data sample across lots of different areas, looking at the current condition, looking at what we might need to do. So looking at how we might do schemes on footways to project what we would need in order to keep those footways in good condition and to bring up the poor footways into good condition and keep them there. So what kind of way, and that was very much about encouraging healthy footways that then have an impact on people's lives and how people use those footways and how much more active they may be. And it looked a lot at how people use footways and the importance of those. So it's not just about the condition of footways in isolation, and your life cycle strategy won't be either. It will be about the condition of that asset in terms of the social value as well as the engineering value. So I'm nearly done. The key points, really, key takeaway points. Life cycle modelling as a principle, it's about producing evidence-based information to understand how best to manage the network. The models are based on as much available knowledge as possible, so they can always adapt and improve. So don't be dismayed if, something that was done 5 years ago, there are lots of different information that comes out that are incorporated in the model, and we can say, actually, we've reduced uncertainty so we can be more clear about this. And that's the same actually about condition surveys too. Condition surveys should always be able to improve. What we need to say to you is, and this is how you can compare to previous. So when we're improving our models, we'll say how we improve them in order that you can, have comparisons between 1 year or 5 years and the next. But you have to understand that in order to be as close as possible to what goes on, we need to improve them over time. It's not easy to apply standard approaches used in other sectors. Like how roads deteriorate is a key factor, and how they deteriorate, well, the key factor in that is how are they built, what do we do to them, what materials do we have, and what do we know about how they deteriorated so far. Uncertainties, always accept that there are uncertainties. If someone comes to you and says, I can tell you absolutely that this road will perform exactly like this over the next 60 years, what you don't want to get sucked into is false certainty. So, we have to be honest about what we don't know as well as about what we do know. Now, that doesn't mean that pulls the legs from under you. Members might want absolute certainty. And you know what, with scheme identification, you can probably give that. We're only looking 5 years ahead. When you're talking maybe 40 or 60, what you have to say is you've taken the best information that you can right now, and looking at that in the future, you're fairly certain that the strategies that you're using now will have this impact in the future. And in a way, that is a bit like weather forecasting. Obviously, the closer you are to the next week or month, the more accurate it can be. And as you go forward, what you're trying to do is just reduce that uncertainty. And the way you're doing that with some very clever stuff in the background with probability theory, but also with lots and lots and lots of data that's been looked at in the past, looking forward into the future. And finally, there isn't necessarily a universal truth. So we can look at the optimal way if you've got a particular strategy that you're going to follow. But it should actually be testing out different strategies and maintenance options. Things don't necessarily stay still, and that model should give you the opportunity to look at different ways of doing things. And it may well be that actually validates the way that you are doing it. So next time, a councillor comes to you and says, well, what do you know? Well, actually, you've tried and tested it, and actually you do know. And this is the best way forward. So, or it might say, well, actually, if we tweak things a little bit, this actually should bring the better optimal results. So you've got that information, and that means you've got the confidence in what you're doing, not just in the immediate term, but in what happens in the future. It also means, I come back to, if you can't get what you absolutely need or what you think would make the better impact in the future, and usually that's about budgets, if you can't get that, well, you have done the best that you can, and you have informed people, and you understand what you're working with. And there isn't anything more that people can ask of you. If you do want to learn more about asset management and the role that Lifecycle model wants to play, and some of you obviously will already have seen these, so there's the well-managed highway infrastructure. It's been around for a while now, a really good code of practice. There's also the HMEP, which brought in the idea of infrastructure asset management. Not that hadn't been around. There was actually county surveyors guidance on asset management before HMEP, and obviously periodically all of these documents get renewed, but they're still good reference documents. And then there is the Institute of Asset Management, which obviously looks at the overview of managing that asset, and some of that obviously is short-term work, and some of that is actually much longer term, because an asset, obviously what we want is to make sure it lasts as long as possible. That is where our value resides, or where our highways value resides.